The colonel's voice cut through the community center like a blade. What in God's name is that? Every head in the room turned toward the back row where an old man sat alone, his threadbare suit jacket covered in tarnished military medals. The colonel stepped away from the podium, his polished shoes catching the fluorescent light, his pressed uniform immaculate against the drab November morning filtering through the windows. He pointed directly at the elderly figure hunched in the last folding chair. "You, stand up. Let everyone see what a fraud looks like on Veterans Day." The old man did not move. His hands, weathered and scarred across the knuckles, remained folded in his lap. His white hair was cropped close to his scalp in a style that hadn't changed in 50 years, and his face carried the deep lines of someone who had spent decades under foreign suns. But what Colonel Raymond Bishop III didn't know, what no one in that room of 200 veterans and family members could possibly know, was that in the next 20 minutes his career would be destroyed, his reputation would be ash, and he would be on his knees begging forgiveness from a man whose name was still classified in 3 countries. The colonel strode down the center aisle, his jaw set with the theatrical rage of a man who had built his entire career on ceremony and appearance. He had been the keynote speaker for 6 consecutive Veterans Day events across the Midwest, and he had never once allowed anything to disrupt his carefully orchestrated tributes to service and sacrifice. Certainly not some homeless vagrant wearing what appeared to be an entire military surplus store-pinned to a jacket held together with mismatched patches and fraying thread. "I asked you a question," the colonel said, stopping 3 rows from the back. His voice carried to every corner of the room, pitched for maximum audience impact. "Where did you get those medals? And I want the truth." The old man looked up slowly. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they held a stillness that seemed out of place on a face so worn by time and hardship. When he spoke, his voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and rough from disuse. "They were issued to me, sir." Laughter burst from the colonel's throat, sharp and dismissive. He turned to face the crowd, arms spread wide, inviting them to share in the absurdity. "Issued to him. Ladies and gentlemen, do you see what I see?" He gestured at the old man's jacket. A silver star, a bronze star with what appears to be 3 valor devices, a purple heart with clusters. And is that, he squinted, leaning closer, is that a presidential unit citation? He shook his head in exaggerated disbelief. "Sir, I have been in the United States Army for 28 years. My father served. My grandfather served. And I have never in my life seen a more obvious case of stolen valor than what is sitting in the back of this room right now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some veterans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others craned their necks to get a better look at the accused. Near the middle of the room, a man with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in uniform studied the old man's jacket with narrowing eyes. His name was Vernon Holt, retired command sergeant major, and something about that metal arrangement was making his chest tight. The colonel took another step forward. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? Any idea what those symbols mean to the men and women who actually earned them?" He jabbed a finger toward a photograph on the wall showing local veterans who had died in service. "Those men gave everything. Everything. And you sit here in your costume jewelry, pretending to be one of them." The old man's expression did not change. His hands remained still in his lap, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the precise way he held them. Fingers relaxed but controlled, the posture of someone trained to remain calm under circumstances far worse than public humiliation. "I meant no disrespect, sir," he said quietly. "I only wanted to pay my respects to the fallen." "Pay your respects." The colonel's voice rose another octave. "You want to pay your respects? You don't do it by wearing medals you bought at a pawn shop. You don't do it by disgracing the memory of actual heroes." He turned to the crowd again. "This is exactly what's wrong with this country. Anyone can claim to be a veteran. Anyone can pin on some ribbons and expect a thank you for your service. But some of us," he placed a hand on his own chest, his own ribbons gleaming under the lights, "some of us actually earn what we wear." A woman near the front row lifted her phone and began recording. Her name was Jennifer Castellano, and she covered community events for the local newspaper. She had expected a routine ceremony, some speeches, some tears, maybe a feature on a local Gold Star family. Instead, she was watching something that made her stomach turn, and her journalist's instinct told her to capture every second. The old man rose slowly from his chair. He moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, but even in rising there was something in his bearing that commanded attention. He stood perhaps 5'10", thin beneath the loose jacket, but his shoulders were squared in a way that seemed automatic, unconscious, the muscle memory of decades. "Sir," he said, and his voice carried a quiet dignity that made several people in the crowd lean forward to hear. "I understand why you might doubt me. I know how I look. I know what you see." He touched the lapel of his jacket where a tarnished silver star hung slightly crooked. "But these medals are mine. I carried them through places you have never heard of. I earned them alongside men whose names I still whisper every morning when I wake up." The colonel's face flushed red. "How dare you? How dare you stand there and lie to these people?" He stepped closer, close enough now that the old man could smell the cologne and the coffee on his breath. "I want you out of this building. Now, before I have you arrested for fraud and trespassing." The old man did not step back. His pale eyes met the colonel's without flinching. "With respect, sir," he said softly, "I will leave if you wish, but I won't apologize for wearing what I earned." Command Sergeant Major Holt was on his feet now, moving through the crowd toward the back of the room. His heart was pounding against his ribs because he had finally seen it. Third row from the top on the old man's jacket, partially hidden by a fold in the fabric. A medal that shouldn't exist on any jacket being worn in public. A medal that had only been awarded 7 times in the entire history of special operations. The colonel stepped closer still, his voice dropping to a hiss meant only for the old man's ears, but carrying further than he intended in the silent room. "I'm going to enjoy watching them take you away in handcuffs. I'm going to enjoy watching you explain to a judge why you thought you could pretend to be something you're not." The old man said nothing, but somewhere behind his eyes, behind years of silence and solitude and grief, something shifted. A door that had been closed for a very long time was beginning to open, and Colonel Bishop had no idea what was about to walk through it. The medals had not always been tarnished. Earl Winslow Taggart could still remember the first time Margaret pinned one to his chest, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked the clasp, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. Fort Bragg, 1982. He had just returned from a place that didn't exist on any map, carrying wounds that would never fully heal and memories that would never fully fade. She had stood on her toes to reach his shoulder, and when the Bronze Star was secure, she had pressed her palm flat against his heart and whispered, "You came back to me. That's the only medal I care about." He had promised her then that he would always come back. Through 37 missions across 4 continents, through firefights and extractions and operations that would remain classified until everyone involved was dead, he had kept that promise. Every time the helicopter lifted off, every time the darkness swallowed him and his team, he had carried her face with him like a talisman. Margaret with her auburn hair and her quiet laugh and her absolute certainty that he would walk through their front door again. She had been wrong only once, but once was enough. The cancer had taken her in 11 months. Pancreatic stage 4 by the time they found it, spreading through her body like fire through dry brush. Earl had been retired by then, had traded the deserts and jungles for a quiet house in Pennsylvania, where he spent his mornings reading and his afternoons working in the garden Margaret had planted. He had survived things that should have killed him 100 times over. He had carried dying men through hostile territory and held positions against impossible odds, and walked into rooms knowing he might not walk out. None of it had prepared him for watching his wife disappear 1 pound at a time, 1 breath at a time, until the woman who had been his anchor for 34 years simply wasn't there anymore. The day after her funeral, he had signed the house over to Rebecca. His daughter had begged him not to, had pleaded with him through tears to stay, to let her take care of him the way he had taken care of her mother. But Earl couldn't look at his daughter without seeing Margaret's eyes looking back at him, and he couldn't walk through that house without hearing her voice in every room, and he couldn't be a father when the only thing holding him together had been lowered into the ground. He had left a note on the kitchen table. 3 sentences. I love you more than you will ever know. I need to find peace with myself before I can be your father again. Don't look for me. That had been 8 years ago. 8 years of walking. 8 years of shelters and park benches and soup kitchens and veterans memorials in cities whose names he sometimes forgot. 8 years of watching his daughter from distances she would never know about, standing in the back of auditoriums during her medical school graduation, lingering outside the hospital in Philadelphia where she now saved lives the way he had once taken them. He kept a photograph of her in his pocket, worn soft at the edges from being touched 10,000 times. She was 36 in the picture, accepting an award for trauma surgery, smiling the smile she had inherited from her mother. He had been so proud of her that day, so proud and so broken and so certain that his presence would only remind her of everything she had lost. The weight of the medals on his jacket was familiar now, though it had not always been. For years after his retirement, he had kept them in a box in the closet, unable to look at them without seeing the faces of the men who had earned them alongside him. Men like Leonard Broussard, who everyone called Lenny, who had been Earl's best friend and point man for 15 years. Lenny who could track a target through triple canopy jungle by the displacement of leaves. Lenny who had taught Earl's daughter to fish and had cried at Earl's wedding and had died in Earl's arms in a compound in Colombia while the extraction helicopter circled overhead and the blood pumped out of him faster than pressure could stop it. The dog tags beneath Earl's shirt were not just his own. Lenny's tags hung there too, cold against his chest, the names and numbers worn smooth by years of contact with skin. Earl spoke to him sometimes, late at night when the shelters were quiet and the darkness pressed close. Still here, brother. Still trying. The words had become a prayer, a promise, a reason to keep walking when every instinct told him to stop. He had started wearing the medals 3 years ago, on a Veterans Day morning when he had woken in a doorway in Kansas City and realized he had forgotten what day it was. The forgetting had terrified him more than any firefight ever had. If he forgot the days, he might forget the names. If he forgot the names, the men who had died under his command would truly be gone. So he had found his old jacket in the bottom of his rucksack, had pinned each medal in its proper place with hands that shook from more than cold, and had worn them every day since. They were not for show. They never had been. They were for remembering. Each ribbon represented a mission. Each clasp represented a man who hadn't come home. The silver star was for Mogadishu, where he had carried a wounded teammate 300 meters through hostile streets while his own leg bled from shrapnel. The bronze stars were for operations whose names he could never speak aloud. The Purple Heart clusters were for the times his body had absorbed what was meant for his brothers. And the medal that Command Sergeant Major Holt had noticed, the 1/3 from the top that had only been awarded 7 times, that was for a night in Panama City when Earl and 3 other operators had done something impossible. Something that had changed the course of an entire operation and saved the life of a man whose name appeared in history books. Something that officially never happened at all. Earl touched his chest now, feeling the dog tags through the thin fabric of his shirt. The colonel was still talking, still performing his outrage for the crowd, but the words had become distant, muffled, like sounds heard underwater. What filled Earl's mind instead was Margaret's voice on their last morning together, weak but clear, her hand cold in his. "You carried so much for so long," she had whispered. "Promise me you'll let someone carry you. Just once. Promise me you'll come back to yourself." He had promised. But promises made to dying women were the hardest kind to keep. The colonel's face was inches from his now, flushed and furious, demanding something Earl couldn't quite hear. Behind him, Earl could see the crowd of veterans watching, some with contempt, some with confusion, a few with something that might have been recognition stirring in their eyes. He could see the woman with the phone recording everything. He could see the gray-haired man pushing through the chairs toward him, moving with an urgency that suggested he had seen something important. For 8 years, Earl had run from everything he was, from his service and his grief and his daughter and his duty to the men who had died believing in him. He had convinced himself that disappearing was a kindness, that his absence was a gift to everyone who had ever loved him. But standing in this room, surrounded by those who had also worn the uniform, watching a man in polished shoes mock everything he had bled for, Earl felt something he had not felt in years. He felt tired of running, and that was the most dangerous thing he could possibly feel. Colonel Bishop was enjoying himself now. The initial flash of anger had settled into something more theatrical, more calculated, the performance of a man who understood that righteous indignation played well to a crowd. He clasped his hands behind his back and began to circle the old man slowly, examining the metal-covered jacket with exaggerated scrutiny while 200 pairs of eyes watched from the folding chairs. "Let's take inventory, shall we?" He reached out and tapped one of the ribbons with his index finger, a gesture designed to demean. "Silver Star. That's awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States." He moved to another medal. "Bronze Star with Valor Device." Actually, he leaned closer, squinting, 3 Valor Devices. That would indicate exceptional meritorious service in combat on 3 separate occasions. He straightened and addressed the crowd with a smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen, if this man's jacket is to be believed, he is one of the most decorated soldiers in modern military history." He let the absurdity hang in the air. And yet here he is, wearing a suit that should have been thrown away a decade ago, attending a community center Veterans Day ceremony, and he glanced around dismissively. "Wherever we are." "Lincoln Community Center," a woman's voice said from the side of the room. Major Diane Okonkwo stood near the refreshment table, her arms crossed over her chest. Her own service ribbons were pinned to her blazer, modest but legitimate, earned in field hospitals in Kuwait and Baghdad. Her dark eyes were fixed on the colonel with an expression that had shifted from discomfort to something colder. "And Colonel, with respect, perhaps we could return to the scheduled program and address any concerns about this gentleman privately." The colonel turned to face her, his smile tightening. "Major, retired, I assume. This is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be addressed publicly." He swept his arm toward the crowd. "Every veteran in this room has earned the right to be here. Every medal in this room represents sacrifice and service. And when someone walks in wearing a costume," he spat the word, "it insults every single one of us." "I didn't mean to insult anyone," Earl said quietly. His voice was steady despite the public humiliation, calm in a way that seemed to unsettle the colonel more than defiance would have. "I came here to honor the fallen. Nothing more. Honor the fallen." The colonel stepped closer, close enough that Earl could see the broken capillaries in his nose, the careful arrangement of his graying hair, the soft hands that had never held a weapon in combat. "You want to honor the fallen? You don't do it by pretending to be something you're not." He jabbed a finger toward Earl's chest. "Take off the jacket." The room went still. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. "Sir," Earl said, and there was something beneath the word now, something that hadn't been there before. A thread of steel wrapped in velvet. "I would prefer not to." The colonel's face darkened. That wasn't a request. From the middle of the room, Command Sergeant Major Vernon Holt had finally pushed his way to the aisle. He stood frozen there, his eyes locked on the old man's jacket, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. He had spent 26 years in the Army, the last 8 working as a liaison with units whose operations he was never fully briefed on. He had learned to recognize the signs of men who had operated in the shadows, the way they moved, the way they stood, the economy of their gestures and the weight behind their silences. And he had learned to recognize certain medals, medals that weren't supposed to exist, medals that were awarded in ceremonies that never appeared in any official record. The medal on the old man's jacket, 3rd row from the top, partially obscured by a fold in the fabric, was one he had seen exactly twice before, both times in photographs, both times on the chests of men whose names were legends whispered in special operations communities from Fort Bragg to Coronado. "Colonel," Holt said, his voice cutting through the tension. His throat was dry and his hands were trembling, and he suddenly felt like a young private again, standing in the presence of something far beyond his understanding. "Colonel, I need to speak with you." Bishop didn't even glance at him. "Not now, Sergeant Major. I'm dealing with a situation." Sir, this is urgent. The colonel finally turned, irritation flashing across his features. What could possibly be more urgent than exposing a fraud in front of every veteran in this building? Holt swallowed hard. His eyes moved from the colonel to the old man, and when they met those pale blue irises, he felt something cold run down his spine. The old man was watching him with an expression that revealed nothing. No fear, no anger, no plea for help, just a quiet patience that seemed to stretch back decades. The patience of someone who had waited in darkness for targets who never knew death was watching. Sir, Holt said carefully, his voice dropping low, I don't think this man is a fraud. The colonel laughed, a sharp bark of disbelief. Oh, you don't think so? And what makes you qualified to make that assessment? Sergeant Major, did you serve with him? Did you verify his service record? Or are you just feeling sympathetic because he's old and pathetic and you think I'm being too hard on him? Jennifer Castellano had moved closer, her phone still recording, her reporter's instincts screaming that something was about to break. She could see the sweat beading on the colonel's forehead despite the cool air. She could see the way the old man's hands had shifted slightly, no longer folded but resting at his sides, fingers relaxed but ready. She had covered enough stories to recognize the moment before everything changed. Colonel, Holt tried again. That medal. Third row. Do you know what that is? Bishop glanced at the indicated ribbon, a small thing, unremarkable in color, easily overlooked among the more prominent decorations. He shrugged. Some unit citation, probably. Probably bought the whole lot at an estate sale. Holt shook his head slowly. That medal, sir, has only been awarded 7 times. His voice cracked on the number. 7 times in the entire history of special operations. It's not available at estate sales. It's not available anywhere. Because officially it doesn't exist. The colonel's smirk faltered for just a moment before he recovered. Ridiculous. You're telling me this homeless person is wearing a classified medal. He turned back to Earl, his voice rising again for the audience. Did you hear that, everyone? Now the story is that he's not just a hero. He's a secret hero. Too secret for any of us to verify. But Holt wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at the old man's forearm, where the sleeve of his jacket had ridden up slightly during the confrontation. There, beneath the grime and the weathered skin, he could see the edge of a tattoo, a dagger, coordinates, and something else, something that made his knees feel weak. He knew that symbol. He knew what it meant. And when his eyes rose to meet the old man's again, he saw something there that confirmed his worst and most magnificent suspicion. Recognition. The old man knew that Holt had seen, and he was waiting to see what Holt would do about it. The jungle had been silent that night. Too silent. Earl remembered the way the air had pressed against his skin like wet cloth, heavy with moisture and the smell of rotting vegetation. Colombia, 1989. They had been hunting a drug lord whose cartel had killed 3 DEA agents, a mission so black that even their own command structure didn't know the full details. 4 operators inserted by helicopter into triple canopy jungle, tasked with gathering intelligence on a compound that officially didn't exist. Lenny had been on point, moving through the darkness with a fluid grace that had made him legendary among the teams. Earl was 30 meters behind, covering their 6, his rifle sweeping the shadows for any sign of the security patrols they knew were out there. The other 2 operators, Martinez and Cole, held the flanks. They had worked together so long that words were unnecessary. A hand signal, a shift in breathing, the angle of a shoulder. That was all they needed. The compound had appeared through the trees like a wound in the jungle, bright lights and concrete walls and guards carrying weapons that had no business being in the hands of drug traffickers. Soviet equipment, professional training. Someone with deep pockets and deeper connections had turned this cartel into something far more dangerous than narcotics. They'd spent 3 hours photographing, cataloging, mapping. 3 hours of controlled breathing and absolute stillness while guards passed within meters of their position. And then, as they began their extraction, everything had gone wrong. The tripwire had been invisible in the darkness. Lenny's boot had caught it at exactly the wrong angle. and the world had exploded into noise and light and the sharp crack of automatic weapons. Earl could still hear it when he closed his eyes. The sound of bullets tearing through leaves. The shouting in Spanish. Lenny's voice cutting through the chaos with coordinates and orders, and then, suddenly, a wet gasp that meant everything had changed. Earl had found him behind a fallen tree, both hands pressed against his stomach, blood pumping through his fingers with every heartbeat. The round had caught him just below the vest, had torn through organs and arteries with the indifferent efficiency of modern ammunition. In the green glow of Earl's night vision, Lenny's face had been pale and calm, the face of a man who understood exactly what was happening to him. "Get out," Lenny had whispered. "Extract. That's an order." Earl had pulled him onto his shoulders instead, had carried him through 800 meters of hostile jungle, while Martinez and Cole laid down suppressing fire and the helicopter screamed toward their position, had felt Lenny's blood soaking through his uniform, warm and then cool and then cold as the minutes stretched into eternities. They had almost made it. The helicopter had been 60 meters away, rotors beating the air into submission, when Lenny had gripped Earl's arm with surprising strength. "Put me down," he had said. His voice was barely audible over the noise, but Earl had heard every word. "Put me down, brother. I'm done." Earl had kept running. Lenny's grip had tightened. "Earl, stop. You're going to get everyone killed trying to save a dead man." The words had hit harder than any bullet. Earl had stumbled, had gone to one knee in the mud, had turned to look at the face of the man who had been his brother in everything but blood. Lenny's eyes were already glazing, but there was something in them that demanded attention. A final order from a dying soldier. "Not your fault," Lenny had whispered. "Never your fault. You did everything right." He had coughed, and blood had flecked his lips. "Tell my sister I love her. Tell her I was thinking about her." Earl had held him as the light faded, had felt the exact moment when Lenny's heart stopped beating, had closed his brother's eyes with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. And then he had taken the dog tags from around Lenny's neck, had pressed them against his own chest, and had run for the helicopter with tears streaming down his face and a weight in his heart that would never fully lift. 24 years. That's how long Earl had carried those tags. Through the rest of his career, through his retirement, through Margaret's illness and death, and his long walk into isolation. Every morning when he woke, the first thing he felt was the cold metal against his skin. Every night before he slept, he whispered the same words into the darkness. "Still here, brother. Still trying." The community center snapped back into focus around him. The colonel was still talking, his voice a distant buzz of accusations and contempt, but Earl wasn't listening. His hand had moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the dog tags hidden beneath his shirt, feeling the familiar edges of names and numbers worn smooth by decades of contact. The colonel noticed the gesture and pounced on it. "What's that? What are you hiding under there?" He stepped forward, reaching toward Earl's collar. "More fake medals. A purple heart you bought online." Earl's hand moved without conscious thought. It intercepted the colonel's wrist with a grip that stopped the larger man mid-motion. Not violent, but immovable, the kind of grip that communicated absolute certainty without saying a word. The colonel's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in anger. "Take your hand off me," Bishop hissed. "That's assault. That's assaulting an officer. You're reaching for something that doesn't belong to you," Earl said quietly. His voice was still calm, but there was granite beneath it now, bedrock that had been forged in jungles and deserts, and all the dark places where men like him had done the work that kept men like the colonel safe. "I would ask you not to do that again." For a moment, the two men stood frozen, locked in a silent contest of wills. The crowd had gone absolutely still. Jennifer Castellano's phone captured every second. Command Sergeant Major Holt watched with his heart in his throat, knowing he was witnessing something that would be talked about for years. And then Earl released the colonel's wrist, gently, almost apologetically, and took a single step back. "I don't want trouble," he said. "I came here to honor the fallen." His hand was still on his chest, still pressing against the metal beneath his shirt. "I carry them with me, every single one, and I won't let anyone take them from me. Not even you." The colonel rubbed his wrist, his face flushed with humiliation and fury. He had been stopped, publicly, by a homeless man in a threadbare jacket. And in that moment, something shifted behind his eyes. Something that moved past theatrical performance and into genuine, personal rage. "This man just assaulted me," Bishop announced to the room. His voice was loud enough to carry to every corner. "I want him arrested. I want him removed from this building in handcuffs. And I want every fake medal on that jacket confiscated as evidence." He pulled out his phone and began to dial. And in the back of the room, a figure who had been sitting quietly in the VIP section rose from his chair. He was older, perhaps 70, with close-cropped silver hair and a bearing that commanded attention without effort. His suit was simple but expensive, and on his lapel, barely visible, were 4 small stars. General Marcus Webb had seen enough. The colonel's thumb was already pressing the numbers when a voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. "That won't be necessary, Colonel Bishop." Every head turned toward the VIP section. General Marcus Webb moved through the row of chairs with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent 40 years giving orders that shaped the course of nations. His silver hair caught the fluorescent light as he stepped into the center aisle, and something in the way he carried himself made the colonel's phone hand freeze mid-dial. "General Webb," Bishop stammered, his voice losing its theatrical edge. "Sir, I didn't realize you were. I mean, I knew you were attending, but I didn't expect you to involve yourself in this." He gestured toward Earl with his free hand. "This man is clearly a fraud, sir. He assaulted me when I tried to examine his fake decorations. I'm simply following protocol for stolen valor cases." Webb said nothing. He continued walking toward the back of the room, his eyes fixed on the old man in the threadbare jacket. With each step, the silence in the community center grew heavier, more charged, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Holt had moved aside to let the general pass, his face pale with the dawning recognition of what was about to happen. He had served under Webb briefly years ago when the general had commanded Joint Special Operations Command. He knew that Webb had access to files and histories that existed in no official database. He knew that Webb had personally signed commendations for operations that would remain classified for another 50 years. And he knew, with sudden and terrible certainty, that Webb recognized the old man. The general stopped 3 feet from Earl. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Webb's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that might have been respect, or sorrow, or both. "It's been a long time," Webb said quietly. Earl's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. His shoulders were squared now, his chin level, his hands at his sides in a position that anyone who had served would recognize. He was standing at attention, not the rigid attention of parade grounds and inspections, but the natural attention of a soldier in the presence of a superior officer. "Yes, sir," Earl said. "It has." The colonel pushed forward, his confusion curdling into desperation. "General, you can't possibly know this man. Look at him. He's homeless. He's wearing medals he couldn't possibly have earned. I've been in the Army for 28 years, and I've never seen a legitimate service record that would justify half the decorations on that jacket." Webb turned slowly to face the colonel. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes made Bishop take an involuntary step backward. "Colonel," Webb said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, "I would strongly advise you to stop talking." "Sir, I'm simply trying to protect the integrity of military service. Stolen valor is a serious offense. This man claims to have earned decorations that would make him one of the most honored soldiers in modern history. Surely you can see how absurd that is." Webb glanced to Holt. "Sergeant Major, what did you notice about this man's medals?" Holt swallowed hard. "Sir, 3rd row from the top. There's a decoration I've only seen twice before, both times in classified photographs. It's the unit citation for Operation Winter Sun, sir. The one that officially never happened." The colonel let out a sharp laugh. "Winter Sunday? I've never even heard of an Operation Winter Sunday." He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms. "Has anyone here heard of Operation Winter Sun?" "No, because it doesn't exist." Because this man is making up stories, and this sergeant major is gullible enough to believe them. You haven't heard of it, Webb said calmly, because you don't have the clearance to hear of it. He turned back to Earl. May I see your forearm? Earl nodded slowly and began to roll up his left sleeve. The fabric was stiff with age and grime, but it yielded to his weathered fingers, revealing inch by inch the skin beneath. First came the edge of a tattoo, dark ink faded by decades of sun and sweat. Then the full image emerged. A dagger, pointed downward, with coordinates inscribed beneath it in precise numerical script. And below the coordinates, a series of initials. LBJMTC, names reduced to letters, memories reduced to ink, brothers reduced to markers on aging skin. Holt made a small sound in his throat. Those coordinates, he whispered. Sir, those are the coordinates for the compound in Columbia. The one from 1809. Webb nodded slowly. He reached out and touched the tattoo with something approaching reverence, tracing the outline of the dagger with his fingertip. I signed a commendation for this operation myself, he said. His voice was barely audible, meant only for Earl and those close enough to hear. I signed it, and then I watched them classify it so deeply that even the men who carried it out were forbidden from speaking of it. The colonel's face had gone slack with confusion. He looked from Webb to Earl to Holt and back again, his certainty crumbling like sandstone in a flood. This is ridiculous, he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. You're telling me this vagrant is some kind of secret war hero, that all these medals are real, that he actually served in operations I've never heard of? Webb turned to face the colonel fully. What I'm telling you, Colonel Bishop, is that you have spent the last 15 minutes publicly humiliating a man whose service record would make your entire career look like a footnote. He paused, letting the words sink in. What I'm telling you is that the medals on that jacket represent more combat action than your entire chain of command has seen combined. And what I'm telling you is that if you had done even the most basic due diligence before making your accusations, you would have noticed that this man's bearing, his composure, and his response to your provocations are consistent with someone who has been trained at the highest levels of special operations. Sir, the colonel started. I'm not finished. Webb's voice hardened. You reached for this man's chest. You attempted to touch personal items that he clearly did not want touched. And when he stopped you, using minimal force and causing you no injury, you called it assault. He shook his head slowly. I've seen men drummed out of the service for less than what you've done here today. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and hidden heroes speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the quiet legends among us. Now, let's continue. The room had gone absolutely silent. 200 veterans sat motionless in their folding chairs, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from shock to vindication. Jennifer Castellano's phone was trembling slightly in her grip, her journalist's mind already writing the headline that would appear in tomorrow's paper and spread across the internet within hours. But Earl wasn't looking at the colonel anymore. His eyes had drifted to the wall behind the podium, where photographs of local veterans hung in neat rows. Men and women who had served. Men and women who had sacrificed. Men and women who had come home, or hadn't, but whose faces were remembered here in this modest community center. He thought of Lenny. He thought of Margaret. He thought of Rebecca, somewhere in Philadelphia, probably elbow-deep in surgery, saving lives without knowing that her father was standing in a room full of strangers, finally being seen for what he was. And for the first time in 8 years, he wasn't sure if he wanted to run. The colonel's phone was still in his hand, forgotten now, the screen dark. His face had cycled through confusion and denial and was settling into something that looked almost like fear. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, then tried again. General, surely there's been some mistake. His voice had lost its thunder. I was simply doing my duty, protecting the honor of legitimate veterans. How was I supposed to know that this man was? He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at Earl, that he was whatever you're claiming he is. Webb's expression didn't soften. You weren't supposed to know, Colonel. That's the point. You weren't supposed to know, so you weren't supposed to assume. He stepped closer to Bishop, and despite being the shorter man, he seemed to tower over him. What you were supposed to do was show basic human decency to a fellow veteran. What you were supposed to do was consider the possibility that appearances can be deceiving. What you were supposed to do was remember that the men who sacrifice the most are often the ones who ask for the least recognition. Command Sergeant Major Holt had moved closer to Earl, his eyes still fixed on the tattoo that remained visible on the old man's forearm. The initials inked into the skin seemed to pulse with meaning now that he understood what they represented. Elbe Leonard Broussard. He had heard that name before, whispered in the halls of Special Operations Commands, spoken with the reverence reserved for men who had given everything. Sir, Holt said softly, addressing Earl directly for the first time. Those initials. Elbe. Is that who I think it is? Earl looked down at his arm, at the faded ink that had been part of his skin for nearly a quarter-century. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Leonard Broussard, Staff Sergeant, best point man I ever worked with. He traced the letters with his fingertip, the gesture unconscious and intimate. He died in my arms in a jungle in Colombia, bled out in 90 seconds while I tried to carry him to the extraction helicopter. He looked up, meeting Holt's eyes. I've carried him with me ever since. His tags, his initials, his memory, every single day for 24 years. The room had gone so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. Veterans in the audience were leaning forward in their seats, some with tears forming in their eyes, others with expressions of dawning recognition. They knew this story, not the specifics, not the classified details, but the shape of it, the weight of it. Every man and woman who had served knew what it meant to carry the fallen. Jennifer Castellano's hand was trembling as she held her phone. She had covered dozens of Veterans Day ceremonies, had written countless stories about service and sacrifice, but she had never witnessed anything like this. The raw truth of it was almost unbearable to watch. Major Okonkwo had moved from her position near the refreshment table and now stood at the edge of the crowd, her arms no longer crossed but hanging at her sides. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She had spent 15 years as an Army nurse, had held the hands of dying soldiers in field hospitals from Kuwait to Kandahar, and she recognized the particular grief that lived behind Earl's pale blue eyes. Survivor's guilt. The terrible weight of being the one who walked away. The colonel was backing up slowly, as if the physical distance might somehow protect him from what was unfolding. His hand had dropped to his side, the phone slipping unnoticed into his pocket. The theatrical rage that had fueled his performance was gone now, replaced by something smaller and uglier. The dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake, compounded by the desperate hope that somehow it could still be undone. General Webb, he tried again. Sir, I apologize if I was overzealous. I was simply trying to protect the integrity of the service. I'm sure you can understand that stolen valor is a serious problem, and I took it upon myself to address what appeared to be a clear case of fraud. His voice was pleading now. I had no way of knowing this man's actual service record. Webb turned to face him fully. You had no way of knowing, he repeated slowly. You had no way of knowing, so you decided to publicly humiliate a 70-year-old man in front of 200 people. You had no way of knowing, so you demanded he remove his jacket and called him a fraud and a disgrace. You had no way of knowing, so you reached for his personal effects without permission and then accused him of assault when he stopped you. Sir, I was following my instincts. Your instincts? Webb's voice was ice. Your instincts told you that a man wearing a silver star, multiple bronze stars with valor devices, a purple heart with clusters, and a unit citation that you'd never seen before must be a fraud. Your instincts told you that his calm demeanor under your attacks was evidence of guilt rather than the composure of a professional. Your instincts told you that his worn clothing meant his service couldn't possibly be legitimate. He took a step closer to Bishop, and the colonel flinched. Let me tell you what my instincts told me, Colonel. My instincts told me, the moment I saw this man enter the room and take a seat in the back row, that he was one of ours. My instincts told me that his bearing, his movements, The way he scanned the exits and positioned himself with a clear line of sight to the door were the habits of someone who had spent decades operating in hostile environments. My instincts told me that a man who pins that many medals to a threadbare jacket and wears it to a community center Veterans Day ceremony isn't looking for attention. He's paying respects to the men those medals represent. Webb paused, letting the silence stretch. The difference between your instincts and mine, Colonel, is that mine were informed by 30 years of working alongside men like him. Men who went places you've never heard of and did things you'll never know about, and came home carrying wounds that don't show up on medical records. Men who earned every decoration on their chests 10 times over and never once asked for recognition. Earl had been standing motionless throughout Webb's defense, his face unreadable. But something was shifting behind his eyes now. A door that had been locked for 8 years was slowly swinging open. He could feel it happening, could feel the walls he had built around himself beginning to crack. "General," he said quietly. His voice cut through the tension like a knife through cloth. "You don't have to do this. I didn't come here looking for vindication. I came here to honor the fallen. Nothing more." Webb turned to face him, and for a moment the two men regarded each other as equals. Two soldiers who had served in the shadows. Two men who understood the cost of the work they had done. "I know why you came," Webb said softly. "But sometimes vindication finds us whether we're looking for it or not." He glanced at the colonel, then back at Earl. "And sometimes the fallen are honored best when the living are given their due." Earl's hand moved to his chest again, pressing against the dog tags hidden beneath his shirt. He could feel Lenny's name under his palm, cold metal against warm skin, the same way it had felt every day for 24 years. And for the first time since Margaret died, he wondered if maybe carrying the weight alone wasn't strength. Maybe it was just another way of hiding. Earl could have walked away. The thought pulsed through his mind with each heartbeat, urgent and familiar. He could turn toward the door right now, push through into the November gray, and disappear the way he had disappeared 1,000 times before. Webb had defended him. The colonel had been silenced. Honor had been satisfied, at least enough to let him slip away without further confrontation. His feet didn't move. The photograph in his pocket seemed to burn against his thigh. Rebecca at 36, accepting her award, smiling her mother's smile. He had watched from the back of that auditorium, too, had slipped out before the applause ended, had walked 17 miles that night because he couldn't afford a bus and couldn't bear to stop moving. She had been so close. Close enough that he could have called her name and she would have heard him. Close enough that he could have seen recognition dawn in her eyes, could have felt her arms around him for the first time in years. He had run instead, the way he always ran. But something was different now. The weight of 200 pairs of eyes. The echo of Webb's words about the fallen being honored when the living receive their due. The memory of Lenny's voice in that jungle, weak and fading, but absolutely certain. Not your fault. Never your fault. For 8 years, Earl had told himself that leaving was a kindness. That Rebecca was better off without a broken father haunting her doorstep. That Margaret would have understood, would have wanted him to find peace even if it meant finding it alone. But standing here, surrounded by veterans who had also served and also sacrificed and also carried invisible wounds, he realized something that cracked through his defenses like a fissure through stone. He hadn't left to protect Rebecca. He had left because he was afraid. Afraid that she would look at him and see the hollow shell of the father she remembered. Afraid that he would have to explain why he couldn't save her mother, couldn't stay, couldn't be the man she needed him to be. Afraid that loving her meant risking the kind of loss that had nearly destroyed him when Margaret died. Running wasn't strength. Running was cowardice dressed in noble clothing. The realization hit him so hard that his knees nearly buckled. He reached out and steadied himself on the back of a folding chair, his weathered hand gripping the cold metal until his knuckles went white. Webb noticed the movement and stepped closer, concern flickering across his features. "Earl," he said quietly, "are you all right?" The use of his first name, spoken by a 4-star general in front of 200 witnesses, seemed to solidify something in the air. The room held its breath. Even the colonel, still standing in humiliated silence near the center aisle, seemed to sense that something important was happening. Earl straightened slowly. His hand released the chair and moved to his chest, pressing against the dog tags that hung over his heart. He could feel both sets of metal beneath his palm. His own tags, worn smooth by decades of contact, and Lenny's tags, still sharp at the edges because Earl had never let them wear down the way his own had. He kept them polished, kept them ready, as if Lenny might need them back someday. "General," Earl said. His voice was stronger now, steadier than it had been since the confrontation began. "I appreciate what you've done here, what you've said, but I didn't come looking for someone to fight my battles for me." Webb nodded slowly. "I know you didn't. I came here because today is Veterans Day." Earl's eyes moved across the room, taking in the faces of the men and women who had gathered to honor their service and the service of those who came before. "I came here because every year on this day, I try to find a place where I can stand among others who understand what it means to serve, what it costs, what it takes from you that you never get back." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, but he pushed through. "I've been walking for 8 years, sleeping in shelters and doorways and under bridges, watching my daughter from distances she'll never know about, telling myself that I was finding peace, that I was healing, that someday I would be ready to go back." He shook his head slowly. "But the truth is I was just running from her, running from myself, running from the weight of everyone I couldn't save." The room was absolutely silent, not the uncomfortable silence of embarrassment or the charged silence of confrontation. This was something different, something sacred, the silence of witnesses to confession. "My wife died 12 years ago." Earl's voice was barely above a whisper now, but it carried to every corner of the community center. "Cancer took her in 11 months. I held her hand at the end, the same way I held Lenny's hand in that jungle. And when she was gone, I looked at my daughter, and all I could see was everything I had failed to protect." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the photograph. Rebecca's face smiled up at him, frozen in a moment of triumph and joy, completely unaware that her father had been watching from 50 feet away. "She's a surgeon now. Trauma surgery. Saves lives every day in Philadelphia." He traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. "I've watched her graduate medical school, watched her complete her residency, watched her accept awards and promotions, and every milestone a father should have been there to celebrate. And every single time, I told myself that my absence was a gift, that she was better off without me." He looked up, meeting Webb's eyes. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air like smoke after battle. Earl's chest was heaving now, 8 years of suppressed emotion threatening to break through the dam he had built around his heart. He could feel the tears forming in his eyes, hot and unfamiliar, and he didn't try to stop them. "I have carried the dead for 24 years, he said. "Lenny, Martinez, Cole, 17 other operators whose names I whisper every morning when I wake up. I carry them because someone has to, because their sacrifice deserves to be remembered, because the weight of them is the only thing that makes me feel like I'm still doing something that matters." His voice broke completely. "But I stopped carrying the living. I stopped carrying my daughter. I stopped carrying myself. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that surviving isn't the same thing as living." Major Okonkwo was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she watched the old man bare his soul to a room full of strangers. Holt had removed his glasses and was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Even Jennifer Castellano had lowered her phone, the journalist in her temporarily overwhelmed by the human being underneath. And in the center aisle, Colonel Raymond Bishop III stood frozen, his face pale and his eyes wide, watching the man he had called a fraud reveal depths of service and sacrifice that made his own 28-year career look like a footnote in someone else's story. Earl looked at the photograph one more time. Then he slid it back into his pocket and straightened his threadbare jacket, squaring his shoulders with the unconscious precision of a soldier preparing for inspection. "I'm done running," he said quietly. "And whatever comes next, I'm going to face it standing up." The silence that followed Earl's declaration stretched across the room like a hell breath. 200 people sat motionless in their folding chairs, witnesses to something none of them had expected when they arrived at the Lincoln Community Center that morning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The November wind rattled the windows. And Earl Winslow Taggart stood among them, tears drying on his weathered cheeks, waiting for whatever came next. It was the colonel who broke the silence. His voice was smaller now, stripped of its theatrical confidence, reduced to something approaching genuine confusion. "I don't understand," Bishop said. He looked from Earl to Webb and back again, his hands spreading in a gesture of helplessness. "Who is this man? What operations? What classified missions? I've been in the Army for 28 years, and I've never heard of any of this." Webb regarded the colonel with an expression that mixed contempt with something that might have been pity. "You've never heard of it, Colonel, because you were never meant to hear of it." He turned to face the room, raising his voice so that every veteran in attendance could hear. "What I'm about to tell you is not classified. It is, however, a matter of record that very few people have ever been authorized to access." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "The man standing before you served in the United States Army for 18 years. His name is Earl Winslow Taggart. His final rank was Sergeant Major. And for the last 14 years of his career, he was a member of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Delta Force. The name carried weight even among those who had never served alongside Special Operations. It was the unit that didn't officially exist, the operators who went where no one else could go, who did what no one else could do. His call sign, Webb continued, "Respecter." And among those who served in the Special Operations community during the 1980s and 90s, that name is spoken with a reverence that most soldiers never earn. Holt's breath caught in his throat. Spectre. He had heard that name before, whispered in briefing rooms, mentioned in after-action reports that were classified above his clearance level. A ghost who moved through enemy territory like smoke through trees, who completed missions that were supposed to be impossible, who brought his men home when every odd was stacked against them. Earl's expression hadn't changed during Webb's introduction. He stood with his shoulders squared and his hands at his sides, accepting the recognition the way he might accept a rainfall. Something that happened to him rather than something he sought. Webb stepped closer to Earl, his voice dropping but still carrying in the silent room. Sergeant Major Taggart participated in 37 classified operations across 4 continents. He earned the Silver Star for gallantry during the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, where he carried a wounded teammate 300 meters through hostile streets while suffering from shrapnel wounds to his own leg. He earned 3 Bronze Stars with Valor Devices for actions in Panama, Colombia, and a location that remains classified to this day. The general's hand moved to the medal that Holt had noticed earlier, the small decoration that had started everything. "And this," Webb said, touching the ribbon with something approaching reverence, "this is the unit citation for Operation Winter Sunday, an operation that took place in December of 1989 during the invasion of Panama. An operation so sensitive that its very existence was denied for 15 years. An operation in which Sergeant Major Taggart and 3 other operators infiltrated a compound held by Panamanian Defense Forces and extracted a high-value American asset who would have been executed within hours." He turned to face the colonel directly. The asset they rescued, Colonel Bishop, was a CIA operative named Kurt Muse. Perhaps you've heard of him. He wrote a book about his captivity and rescue. It was called 6 Minutes to Freedom. The operation that saved his life was called Acid Gambit. Webb paused. Sergeant Major Taggart was one of the 4 men who went into that prison. One of the 4 men who walked out with Muse while the entire Panamanian Defense Force tried to stop them. The colonel's face had gone white. Kurt Muse. He knew that name. Everyone who had studied military history knew that name. The rescue of Kurt Muse was legendary, taught in war colleges and special operations training courses around the world. It was considered one of the most daring and successful hostage rescues in American military history. And he had just spent 15 minutes calling one of the men who carried it out a fraud. General Bishop stammered, "Sir, I had no idea. There was no way I could have known." He looked at Earl with new eyes, seeing for the first time the operator beneath the threadbare clothing. I was just trying to protect the integrity of military service. I never meant to disrespect a genuine hero. Earl spoke for the first time since Webb had begun. His voice was quiet, but carried an edge that hadn't been there before. A coldness that hinted at the man he had been in darker places. You didn't disrespect me, Colonel. His pale eyes met Bishop's, and the colonel flinched as if struck. You disrespected every veteran in this room by assuming that appearance equals authenticity. You disrespected every homeless veteran sleeping under a bridge tonight by treating poverty as evidence of fraud. You disrespected every man and woman who serve in the shadows by demanding that sacrifice announce itself in ways you find acceptable. He took a step forward, and the colonel took a step back. I have buried 17 men who serve under my command. Earl's voice was rising now, gaining strength with each word. 17 men who followed me into places that would give you nightmares, who trusted me to bring them home, who died believing that their sacrifice meant something. I have carried their names and their faces and their last words for decades. I have whispered their names every morning and every night. I have visited their graves and their memorials and their families. And I have never once asked for recognition, never once demanded that anyone acknowledge what we did or what it cost us. His hand moved to his chest, pressing against the dog tags hidden beneath his shirt. These medals are not for show, Colonel. They are not decorations. They are headstones. Every ribbon on this jacket represents a mission where men bled and died and sacrificed everything they had. And when you called them fake, when you demanded I remove them, when you reached for my chest to tear them away, you weren't insulting me. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. You were insulting them, the fallen, the brothers I carry with me every single day. And that is something I will never forgive. The room was absolutely still. No one moved. No one breathed. The weight of Earl's words pressed down on every person present like a physical force, demanding acknowledgement, demanding response. Colonel Raymond Bishop III stood frozen in the center aisle, his career crumbling around him, his certainty shattered, his face reflecting the dawning horror of what he had done. And Earl Winslow Taggart, call sign Spectre, stood before him with tears on his cheeks and steel in his spine, finally allowing the world to see the warrior he had spent 8 years trying to bury. The first veteran to stand was an old man in the third row. He wore a faded army jacket with patches from the 101st Airborne, and his hands trembled as he pushed himself up from his folding chair. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stood at attention, his right hand rising to his brow in a salute that shook with age but held steady through sheer force of will. A woman in the 5th row stood next, Navy insignia on her collar, tears streaming down her face. Her salute joined the first, then another, and another, and another. Within 60 seconds, half the room was on its feet, veterans of Korea and Vietnam and Desert Storm and Iraq and Afghanistan. Men and women who had served in every branch and every era, rising from their chairs like a tide coming in. Some saluted. Some simply stood with their hands over their hearts. Some wept openly, decades of their own buried service and sacrifice rising to the surface in the presence of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing. Earl stood motionless at the back of the room, watching the wave of recognition wash over him. His throat had closed so tight he couldn't have spoken if he tried. 8 years of isolation. 8 years of invisibility. 8 years of convincing himself that he didn't need acknowledgement, didn't deserve recognition, didn't want anyone to see the broken man he had become. And now 200 people were seeing him, really seeing him, not the threadbare jacket or the worn shoes or the grime of homeless life. They were seeing the soldier underneath, the warrior, the brother who had carried the fallen and been carried by them in return. Command Sergeant Major Holt approached slowly, his own salute crisp and unwavering. When he reached Earl, he held the position for a long moment before dropping his hand and extending it instead. Sergeant Major Taggart, Holt said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is an honor to be in your presence, sir." Earl, took the offered hand. His grip was firm despite his age, the strength of decades of service still living in his fingers. "The honor is mine, Sergeant Major. You saw what others missed. That takes a different kind of training." Holt shook his head. "I almost didn't say anything. Almost let that bastard keep going." He glanced toward the colonel, who remained frozen in the center aisle like a man watching his own execution. "I should have spoken up sooner." "You spoke up when it mattered." Earl released his hand. "That's all any of us can do." General Webb had stepped back, allowing the moment to unfold without his intervention. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that room, what this recognition meant to a man like Earl. Special operators lived in shadows. They carried out missions that would never be acknowledged, earned decorations that would never be displayed, sacrificed in ways that would never be thanked. To be seen, truly seen, after so many years of deliberate invisibility was a gift that couldn't be measured. Major Okonkwo pushed through the standing crowd and approached Earl with a tissue in her hand. She didn't salute. Instead, she reached up and gently wiped the tears from his weathered cheeks, the gesture maternal and tender and completely without pretense. "I run a veterans outreach program through this community center," she said softly. "We help people who are struggling to find their way back. Housing assistance, job placement, counseling. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, just people who understand helping people who need it." Earl started to shake his head, the old instinct to refuse help rising automatically. "Major, I appreciate the offer, but I don't need charity. I've been taking care of myself for a long time." Okonkwo's hand remained on his cheek, holding him still with surprising gentleness. "It's not charity, Sergeant Major. It's what we owe you. What we owe every veteran who falls through the cracks of a system that should have caught them." She lowered her hand and met his eyes directly. "You spent 18 years taking care of others. Maybe it's time to let someone take care of you." Before Earl could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A young man in army dress uniform had pushed through the doors and was scanning the crowd with urgent eyes. He spotted General Webb and hurried forward, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. "Sir," the young man said breathlessly. He was a captain, his uniform immaculate, his face flushed with exertion. "I just received word from Division. The video of this confrontation is already online. It's been viewed over 200,000 times in the last 20 minutes. News outlets are picking it up. CNN is running it on their breaking news ticker." Webb's expression didn't change. "Of course they are." He glanced at Jennifer Castellano, whose phone was still recording, her journalist's instincts apparently overriding her emotional response to the scene. The story of a decorated special operator being publicly humiliated by an Army colonel on Veterans Day would be irresistible to the 24 news cycle. The captain swallowed hard. "Sir, there's more." He looked at the colonel, who had finally unfrozen and was staring at the young officer with dawning horror. "Colonel Bishop's commanding officer has already issued a statement. He's been relieved of his current duties pending a full investigation." Bishop's face went gray. "Relieved?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I've been relieved." The captain nodded, clearly uncomfortable with being the bearer of this particular news. "Yes, sir. Effective immediately. You're to report to your duty station first thing tomorrow morning and surrender your credentials." The room had gone quiet again, but this was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of justice being served, of consequences arriving, of a man who had wielded power carelessly finally understanding that power could be taken away. Webb stepped closer to the colonel, his voice pitched low but carrying in the stillness. "I warned you to stop talking, Colonel. I gave you multiple opportunities to recognize your mistake and withdraw gracefully. You chose instead to double down on your accusations, to demand arrest and prosecution, to reach for a decorated veteran's personal effects without permission." He shook his head slowly. "What happens next is entirely of your own making." Bishop looked around the room, at the standing veterans still holding their salutes, at the phones still recording, at the faces that ranged from contempt to pity to cold satisfaction. His mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. "I'm sorry," he finally managed. His voice cracked on the words. "Sergeant Major Taggart, I'm sorry. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. I said things I shouldn't have said. I was wrong. Earl regarded him for a long moment. The anger that had fueled his earlier words had faded, replaced by something that might have been exhaustion or might have been grace. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. I don't need your apology, Colonel. I've survived things that would break you. Your words can't hurt me. He paused, his pale eyes holding Bishop's gaze. But I hope you remember this moment the next time you see a veteran who doesn't look the way you think a veteran should look. I hope you remember that sacrifice doesn't always wear a pressed uniform. And I hope you spend the rest of your career trying to be worthy of the service you claim to represent. He turned away from the colonel then, dismissing him as completely as if he had ceased to exist. His eyes found Webb, found Holt, found Okonkwo still standing nearby with hope in her expression. And for the first time in 8 years, Earl Winslow Taggart allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe he didn't have to carry everything alone. The crowd had begun to move now, veterans approaching Earl in small groups. Each one wanted to shake his hand, or share a word, or simply stand in his presence for a moment. They came with stories of their own service, their own losses, their own invisible wounds. A Marine who had served in Fallujah told Earl about the 3 friends he had lost in a single afternoon. A Navy corpsman described holding a dying soldier's hand in a field hospital in Afghanistan. An Air Force veteran spoke quietly about the guilt she carried for surviving a helicopter crash that killed everyone else on board. Earl listened to each one. He didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. He simply listened, nodding occasionally, his pale eyes holding theirs with an understanding that required no words. These were his people, broken in ways that couldn't be seen, carrying weights that couldn't be measured, surviving in a world that didn't always know how to welcome them back. General Webb had retreated to the side of the room, observing the scene with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something deeper. He had known Earl Taggart decades ago, had signed the commendations for missions that would never be spoken of publicly, had watched him disappear after Margaret's death, and wondered if he would ever surface again. To see him standing here, surrounded by those who honored his service, felt like the closing of a circle that had been left incomplete for far too long. The captain who had delivered news of the colonel's relief approached Webb with a tablet in his hand. "Sir," he said quietly, "I've been monitoring the response to the video. It's trending nationally now. Over 1 million views in the last hour. News crews are already on their way to the community center." Webb nodded slowly. He glanced at Earl, still surrounded by well-wishers, and made a decision. "Clear them out. Tell them this is a private ceremony for veterans only. No press access." "Sir," the captain hesitated. "The Public Affairs Office is recommending we get ahead of the story. They want to arrange an interview with Sergeant Major Taggart to control the narrative." Webb's eyes hardened. Earl Taggart spent 18 years operating in the shadows specifically so he wouldn't have to control any narratives. He's not a prop for the Army's public relations. He's a man who deserves to be left alone if that's what he wants. He paused. "Clear out the press." "That's an order." The captain saluted and moved toward the entrance, already speaking into his phone. Near the refreshment table, Jennifer Castellano had finally lowered her phone and was watching the scene with conflicted eyes. She had the story of a lifetime in her hands. A decorated special operator humiliated by an arrogant colonel on Veterans Day, the confrontation going viral, the colonel's career destroyed in real time. It had everything: drama, justice, redemption. But she had also watched an old man weep as he spoke about his dead wife and estranged daughter. She had seen the private grief that lived behind his public composure. And she found herself wondering whether some stories were better left untold. Major Okonkwo appeared at her elbow. "You got good footage," the major said. It wasn't a question. Castellano nodded. "Enough to file a dozen stories." Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. "That man has been through things and I can't imagine. He's been invisible for 8 years, hiding from his own family, carrying guilt that would crush most people." She turned to face the reporter directly. "If you run this story, you'll be famous. But you'll also be dragging him back into a spotlight he's spent almost a decade trying to avoid." Castellano looked at her phone, then at Earl, then back at Okonkwo. "I'm a journalist. This is what I do. I know. Okonkwo's voice was gentle. I'm not asking you to kill the story. I'm asking you to think about what kind of story it should be. She paused. He's not a spectacle. He's a human being. Maybe the story isn't about what happened to him today. Maybe it's about what happens to thousands of veterans every day. The ones who fall through the cracks. The ones who disappear. The ones who carry their service in silence because no one taught them how to put it down. Castellano was quiet for a long moment. Then she slipped her phone into her pocket. I'll think about it, she said, and something in her voice suggested she actually would. Across the room, Earl had finally extricated himself from the crowd of well-wishers and found a quiet corner near the windows. The November light fell across his face, softening the deep lines and highlighting the pale blue of his eyes. He looked exhausted, drained, like a man who had been running a marathon for 8 years and had finally been given permission to stop. Webb approached slowly, giving Earl time to register his presence. The two men stood side by side, looking out at the gray November sky. What happens now? Earl asked quietly. That depends on you. Webb's voice was equally soft. The video is everywhere. Your story is going to come out whether you want it to or not. The question is what you do with the attention. Earl was silent for a moment. I didn't want this, he finally said. I just wanted to pay my respects to the fallen. I didn't want to become a story. Webb nodded. I know, but sometimes we don't get to choose what happens to us. We only get to choose how we respond. He turned to face Earl directly. You could disappear again, walk out that door, and keep walking the way you've been walking for 8 years. No one would stop you. No one would blame you. But, Earl prompted, but you have a daughter in Philadelphia who has been looking for you for almost a decade. And I suspect that right now, someone is showing her the video that's been seen by 2 million people. And when she sees your face, she's going to know that her father is alive. Earl's breath caught in his throat. The photograph in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, pressing against his leg like an anchor or a lifeline. Rebecca, his little girl who wasn't little anymore, who had grown into a woman while he watched from the shadows, who had probably given up hope of ever seeing him again. You could keep running, Webb said softly, or you could stay. You could let that woman find you. He paused. Margaret asked you to come home, didn't she? Before she died. She asked you to find your way back. Earl's eyes had filled with tears again. How did you know that? Because that's what wives ask. What mothers ask. What anyone who loves a soldier asks. Webb's hand came to rest on Earl's shoulder, a gesture of connection and support. You've honored the fallen for 24 years, Earl. Maybe it's time to honor the living. Maybe it's time to honor yourself. Earl stood motionless, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Outside, the November clouds were beginning to break apart, thin shafts of pale sunlight piercing through to touch the parking lot and the bare trees and the ordinary world that had somehow become the stage for his resurrection. He had carried the dead for so long, had let their weight become his identity, his purpose, his excuse for avoiding everything that might bring him back to life. But the dead didn't need him to carry them anymore. They needed him to live. And somewhere in Philadelphia, a woman who had his wife's eyes was about to learn that her father had finally stopped running. The call came 3 hours later. Earl was sitting in Major Okonkwo's office at the back of the community center, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, when her desk phone rang. She answered it, listened for a moment, and then her eyes lifted to meet his with an expression that made his heart stop. There's someone here to see you, she said softly. She came from Philadelphia. Earl couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except sit there with the cold coffee cup pressed between his palms, feeling the world tilt beneath him. 8 years. 8 years of watching from the shadows, of convincing himself that his absence was kindness, of running from the one person who had never stopped looking. And now she was here, standing somewhere in this building, waiting for a father who had abandoned her. Okonkwo rose from her desk and moved to the door. I'll give you a moment, she said. Then she paused, her hand on the frame. Earl. She hasn't stopped crying since she walked in, but they're not angry tears. She smiled gently. They're relief. The door closed behind her, and Earl was alone with the weight of everything he had avoided for nearly a decade. He looked down at his hands, still wrapped around the coffee cup. The same hands that had held Lenny as he died. The same hands that had carried Margaret's coffin to her grave. The same hands that had written a 3-sentence note and walked away from his only child. He set the cup down slowly and reached into his pocket. The photograph was there, worn soft at the edges, Rebecca's face smiling up at him from a moment of triumph he had witnessed from 50 feet away. She had been 36 in that picture. She was 44 now. 8 years of her life that he had missed. 8 years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings that a father should have shared with his daughter. The door opened. She stood in the doorway like a vision from a dream he had forbidden himself to have. Her hair was darker than he remembered, shorter now, practical for a surgeon who spent her days bent over operating tables. Her eyes were Margaret's eyes, the same warm brown that had looked at him with love for 34 years. She was wearing scrubs under a hastily thrown jacket, as if she had walked out of the hospital without stopping to change. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with 8 years of absence and grief and desperate hope. Then Rebecca's face crumpled, and she crossed the room in 3 steps and threw her arms around him. Earl caught her the way he had caught her when she was a child, when she would run across the yard and launch herself at him and trust completely that he would never let her fall. His arms wrapped around her, and he held on with everything he had, feeling her shake with sobs against his chest, feeling his own tears streaming down his face, feeling for the first time in 8 years like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Daddy." Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "Daddy, I thought you were dead. I'm sorry." The words came out broken, inadequate for the weight of what he had done. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I thought I was protecting you. I thought you were better off without me." She pulled back just enough to look at his face, her hands gripping his arms as if she was afraid he might disappear again. "Better off." Her voice cracked on the words. "I've spent 8 years looking for you. I hired private investigators. I called every shelter and veterans organization in the country. I drove to every city where someone thought they might have seen you." She shook her head, tears still streaming. "How could you think I was better off without my father?" Earl reached up and wiped the tears from her cheeks. The same gesture Okonkwo had made hours earlier, but this time weighted with a lifetime of love and regret. "After your mother died, I couldn't look at you without seeing her. Every time I saw your face, I felt like I was losing her all over again." He swallowed hard. "I told myself I was sparing you the burden of a broken man. But the truth is I was running from my own pain, and I left you to carry yours alone." Rebecca's grip on his arms tightened. "I needed you." Her voice was barely a whisper. "When Mom died, I needed you. And you just left." "I know." Earl's voice broke completely. "I know, sweetheart. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. If you'll let me." She stared at him for a long moment, her mother's eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because the tension in her shoulders slowly released and she pulled him close again. "I watched the video," she said against his shoulder. "I was in surgery when someone showed it to my resident. I walked out in the middle of the procedure, just handed off to my attending and walked out." She laughed, a wet sound that was half sob. "I've never done that before. Never. But I saw your face on that screen and nothing else mattered." Earl held her tighter. "I've watched you," he confessed, "over the years. I came to your graduation from medical school, stood in the back and left before you could see me. I was there when you accepted that award for trauma surgery. I've walked past your hospital just to see the building where you work." Rebecca pulled back again, her eyes wide. "You were there, at my graduation." She shook her head in disbelief. "I thought I felt something that day, like someone was watching me. Mom always said you had a way of being present without being seen." The mention of Margaret sent a fresh wave of grief through both of them. Earl reached up and touched the chain around his neck, pulling the dog tags free from beneath his shirt. Lenny's tags hung there alongside his own, and next to them, threaded onto the same chain, was a simple gold band. "I still wear her ring," he said quietly. "Every day. She's still with me. Always will be." Rebecca reached out and touched the ring, her fingers tracing the familiar curve of metal that had once circled her mother's finger. "She would be so angry at you." she said softly. For leaving. For disappearing. For making me worry. I know, but she would also be so proud. Rebecca looked up at him with Margaret's eyes full of Margaret's love. She would be proud that you finally stopped running, that you let yourself be seen, that you're standing here now, with me, instead of hiding in the shadows. Earl cupped his daughter's face in his weathered hands. I'm done hiding, he said. I'm done running. I don't know how to be a father anymore. I don't know how to be anything except a soldier and a ghost. But if you'll have me, if you'll give me a chance, I want to try. I want to come home. Rebecca covered his hands with her own. You don't have to try to be a father, she said. You just have to be here. That's all I've ever wanted. Just for you to be here. Outside the office window, the November sun had finally broken through the clouds completely. Golden light streamed across the parking lot and through the glass, illuminating the two figures holding each other in the small, cluttered room. Father and daughter, reunited after 8 years of silence. And in Earl's chest, in the space where he had carried nothing but grief and guilt for so long, something new was beginning to take root. Something that felt like hope. 3 months later, Earl stood in front of a room full of strangers and spoke for the first time about the night Lenny died. The Veteran Support Group met every Thursday evening in the basement of a church 3 blocks from Rebecca's apartment in Philadelphia. 12 folding chairs arranged in a circle. A coffee maker that had seen better decades. Fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered in a way that reminded Earl of the community center where everything had changed. Major Okonkwo had connected him with the group leader, a former Army chaplain named Father David who had served 2 tours in Iraq and understood that some wounds couldn't be healed with scripture alone. For the first 6 weeks, Earl had simply listened. He sat in his chair with his hands folded in his lap and let the others speak, absorbing their stories of loss and guilt and the slow, painful work of learning to live again. He heard a young Marine describe the IED that killed his best friend. He heard a grandmother who had served as a nurse in Vietnam talk about the faces she still saw when she closed her eyes. He heard a former Ranger confess that he hadn't slept through the night in 15 years. And then, on the 7th Thursday, Father David had looked at him with gentle eyes and asked if he had anything he wanted to share. Earl had started talking and hadn't stopped for 40 minutes. He told them about Lenny, about the jungle in Colombia and the tripwire and the 90 seconds that had stretched into an eternity. He told them about carrying his brother through 800 meters of hostile territory, feeling the blood soak through his uniform, knowing with each step that he was losing him. He told them about the last words. Not your fault. Never your fault. And he told them about the 24 years he had spent trying to believe those words and failing. When he finished, the room was silent. Then the young Marine reached over and put a hand on Earl's shoulder, and the grandmother nodded with tears in her eyes, and the former Ranger said quietly, I carry 3 names. Now I know I'm not alone. That had been the beginning. Rebecca had given him the spare bedroom in her apartment, the one she had kept ready for 8 years just in case he ever came home. She didn't push him to talk about where he had been or what he had done. She simply made sure there was food in the refrigerator and coffee in the pot, and a door that was always unlocked when he needed to take his walks. Some nights, he wandered the streets of Philadelphia until dawn, working through the restlessness that still lived in his bones. But he always came back, and she was always there when he did. The story of the Veterans Day confrontation had faded from the national news within a week, replaced by other outrages and other viral moments. Jennifer Castellano had written her article, but not the one she could have written. Instead of focusing on the confrontation and the colonel's humiliation, she had told a different story. A story about the thousands of homeless veterans living on American streets. A story about the systems that failed them and the people who were trying to help. She had interviewed Major Okonkwo and Father David and a dozen other advocates who were doing the quiet work of bringing soldiers home from wars that never really ended. The article had been picked up by the Associated Press. It had sparked a congressional hearing on veteran services. It had raised over $2 million for homeless veteran programs across the country. And it had mentioned Earl only once, in a single paragraph, identifying him simply as a decorated special operations veteran who wished to remain anonymous. Colonel Raymond Bishop III had quietly retired from the Army 6 weeks after the incident. There had been no court-martial, no public disgrace beyond what the viral video had already inflicted. He had simply disappeared into civilian life, his 28-year career ending not with honors but with silence. Earl didn't know where he was now, and he didn't care. The colonel had been a catalyst, nothing more. A spark that had ignited something that needed to burn. General Webb had visited once in December, bringing with him a wooden box that contained every medal and commendation Earl had ever earned, properly mounted and preserved. Earl had accepted the box with quiet thanks and placed it on the shelf in his bedroom, next to the photograph of Rebecca at her award ceremony and the worn Bible the chaplain had given him in Panama. The medals didn't define him anymore, but they were part of his story, and he was finally learning that his story didn't have to end with loss. On a Sunday morning in February, Earl and Rebecca drove to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. The snow had fallen overnight, covering the headstones in a blanket of white that seemed to soften the edges of grief. They walked together through the rows until they reached the familiar stone, Margaret's name carved deep into the granite, the dates of her life marking a span that had been far too short. Rebecca hung back, giving Earl space. He knelt in the snow, not caring about the cold that seeped through his pants, and pressed his palm flat against the frozen stone. For a long moment, he simply breathed, feeling the presence of the woman who had been his anchor for 34 years. "I stopped running," he said quietly. "Finally, like you asked." He traced the letters of her name with his fingertip. "I'm living with Rebecca now. She's taking care of me, the way you always said she would. The way I should have let her take care of me years ago." He reached up and touched the ring that still hung around his neck. "I still carry you with me. Every day. But I'm learning that carrying you doesn't mean I have to carry the weight alone." He paused, his voice thickening. "I'm learning that honoring the dead means living for them, not dying with them." The wind picked up, swirling snow across the cemetery in patterns that caught the winter light. Earl closed his eyes and let himself feel it, the cold and the silence, and the presence of something he couldn't name but had never stopped believing in. "I'll see you again someday," he whispered. "But not yet. I've still got work to do." He rose slowly, his knees protesting the cold, and turned to find Rebecca waiting with tears on her cheeks and her mother's smile on her face. She didn't say anything. She just took his hand and held it, and together they walked back through the snow toward the car, toward the city, toward the life that was waiting for them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible, that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you'll see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember, every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching. That night, Earl sat in the circle of folding chairs and listened to a new veteran tell his story for the first time. The young man's hands were shaking and his voice kept breaking, and he couldn't seem to find the words for what he had seen and done and lost. Earl leaned forward and caught his eye. "Take your time," he said softly. "We're not going anywhere. None of us are going anywhere." The young man nodded, swallowed hard, and started again. And Earl listened, the way someone had finally listened to him, knowing that this was how healing happened. One story at a time, one breath at a time, one moment of connection in a world that often felt too broken to bear. Still here, he thought, touching the dog tags beneath his shirt. Still trying. And for the first time in 24 years, he believed that trying might actually be enough.